Welcome to this week's presentation on the listening construct, where we're going to be looking at defining what listening is in relation to elementary level items. So in the case of Aptis, that refers to our items which target A1. So our objectives for this presentation are to first of all introduce you to our definition of the listening construct. So what it means to actually listen to something, to process something orally. To define various sub-skills associated with that listening construct. So a more precise definition of the kinds of cognitive processes we may be targeting in our individual tasks. And then in particular at lower levels to think which sub-skills might be most appropriate at A1 and A2 level, for example. And then similarly, which tasks can appropriately and effectively target those sub-skills. Okay, so thinking about the listening construct more broadly, test developers and item writers need to have a good understanding of some of the following issues. So we need to understand what listening is. This was something we mentioned in week 1. If you want to measure something, if you want to test something, you have to know what it is you're trying to target. So you have to have a clear definition of what the process involves. And in the case of listening, that's not necessarily straightforward because it's an invisible cognitive process. We don't really know what's going on inside people's heads as they are listening to something. We need to think about an appropriate context. So when and why do people listen? For what different reasons? And how does it differ from context to context and even from listener to listener, from person to person? And also to appreciate that spoken language is different from written language. And if we want to have an authentic listening task, then it does need to mirror the spoken form of a language as much as possible. We can't just read out an essay or an extract from a book, because that would not really be authentic. On this slide, we have a conceptual framework of the listening process. This was published by John Field in 2005 and defines what it means to listen at different levels. So basically at the bottom, we're talking about listening to sounds and to words, and as we go higher, increasingly we're listening at discourse level. So understanding when somebody speaks, when we listen to something, creating a mental representation of the entire text and understanding what is meant with contextual clues, background knowledge, and that kind of thing. And it's important to point out as well that these can also happen simultaneously as well. So we can be carrying out a lexical search while we're also constructing a representation of a wider discourse and that kind of thing. For the purposes of testing, however, when we talk about listening items, at lower levels, you'll see items which are targeting these lower level processes at word level, at utterance level, and then as we go up into more advanced levels, we want to see items which are testing whether candidates can infer meaning, use the entire discourse to get to the key, and those kinds of skills. Let's think about how the spoken form of the language is unique, how it differs from the written form. In Aptis, we don't use authentic materials, we do script our listening tasks, but at the same time we do want them to mirror authentic spoken language use as far as possible. So to do that, you might want, for example, to include some pauses, hesitations, and fillers. I like, you know, I mean, that kind of thing. So if you want somebody to say or you do need to script that, you do need to put it in. Also, spoken language typically contains simpler syntax, so you won't want long, convoluted sentences if you're writing a listening text, even at higher levels, because typically that's not how people speak, especially if we're using discourse markers. So it's unlikely to have a person who continually uses discourse markers like therefore and in addition and so on. Much more typically when people speak, they're saying things like and, but, or things like that. And this can be used as well. So even at higher levels, we do want to think about things such as how we might modify the grammar or the discourse markers to make it sound like somebody is actually speaking in real time. We do see dialect, slang and colloquialism in authentic text, although in the case of Aptis at least, we tend to avoid it. So that's where we make a compromise. For authenticity. So even though it would be authentic to have slang expressions, we don't want to see them for the simple reason they could potentially discriminate against particular test takers. Because they're region specific, they're dialect specific. So if a test taker has learned English in a particular region where they happen to use that expression quite a lot, it would give them an unfair advantage. Similarly, if they haven't studied in America and somebody uses a typical American slang expression, for instance, that would also be an unfair advantage. So this tends to be avoided, even though it may make the text a little less authentic. Also, as well, prosodic cues. So when we talk about how meaning is conveyed when we speak and when we listen, it's not just what is said, but also how it is said. That can be incredibly important. So if something should be stressed, or if the intonation should be in a particular place, then it's quite important to mark that on your script so we know what we are. So, with that framework by field in mind that we looked at just now, how might we divide listening into sub-skills which would target those different levels of listening? So tasks may require test takers to distinguish phonemes. That is not something that's used in Aptis, but there are certainly tasks which exist which do that. So ship and sheep, for example, so minimal pairs and so on. Understanding intonation for meaning, again, that's not used in Aptis, but is also a task that you might see in other papers. And then when we get into things like listening for detail, listening for the main idea, listening for inference, this is where we're getting into those different levels. So if you're listening for detail, that might mean that the information is contained within a single utterance, which would be a relatively low order skill. Whereas if we're listening for inference, this means you need to listen to extended sections of the discourse, listen between the lines, get an overall sense, which would be a much higher order skill, as well as things like understanding humour, irony, sarcasm, which again, you do see it, but I feel it should generally be avoided because, like slang and colloquialisms, it can be culture and region specific, giving particular people an advantage or otherwise, depending on whether they have lived there. And the same for accents. We are moving towards ELF, English as a lingua franca, world Englishes, and yes, somebody should be able to understand a variety of different accents, but we are still using a fairly standard varieties so that no one is unfairly disadvantaged for that reason. It's an interesting question and it's a balancing act, but that's the current state in Aptis at least. So when we think about how this might translate into task types, this is not an exhaustive list and not all of these appear in Aptis, But these are some common task types, and as with everything, all task types have their advantages and their disadvantages. So MCQs, for example, comprehension questions where you have 3 or 4 options, these are very common. The advantage of MCQs is that they can target any level on that framework. So they can target information at word level, and they can target understanding and information at a higher discourse level as well. True, false, not given. This is good. I find these are quite good at intermediate levels, because at higher levels, if something is left unsaid, it could still be inferred, and therefore potentially either false or not given. So they're a little bit problematic in that regard. And so on. So we have tests where we have phoneme discriminations, test of stress or intonation. As I mentioned, I haven't seen many of these recently, but do correct me if I'm wrong. Gap fills so we give test takers a selection of words or phrases with which they need to fill the gap. Or short answer format. This is where we don't give them anything at all, but they need to fill in the gap with 2 or 3 words. The disadvantage with short answer format being that issue of short-term memory, how much information we can expect test takers to retain as they're making notes, and also the variability. Factors that influence item difficulty. So we want to grade the items to the appropriate level, so we need to think about these 3 things really then. So we need to grade the input, so that is the text that they are listening to. We need to grade the items that are based upon that text, and then the response format as well. An interesting question is whether we grade the text or the task. Some would say that authenticity is always much better in listening and reading, and we grade the task accordingly to what we would expect test takers at different levels of ability to do. Aptist doesn't take that approach. Aptist takes the approach that the test and the task are at level. And this is based upon the CEFR. So here we have the CEFR at A1 and A2 according to listening band descriptors. So the emphasis at both of these levels is very much upon slower speech, clear speech, and concrete information. So at A2 level, for example, we can see understanding phrases and expressions related to areas of immediate priority, and at A1 level, again, it's emphasizing slow speech, long pauses, and this is how we, and this is what listeners upon. So let's have a quick look at some examples of an A1 task specification. Have a look at the task focus, for example. So the A1 listening task is a short monologue and a multiple choice. So the test taker chooses the best option to answer a question or to complete a statement. Now the task focus requires that that information is specific. It should be a word, phrase, or number, and it should be the key information in a short message, usually a message on an answer phone. And importantly, the target information isn't paraphrased, so it's quoted verbatim, and the distractors are not used in the input text. So we can see we're operating at a very low level here, a very simple level. And then it goes through the features of the text. It's quite short, a maximum of 110 syllables, and everything should be graded at a K1 lexical level and at an A1. Compare that here now to A2 listening specifications. Essentially, it's very similar. The differences are that there's a bit more variability allowed in the type of text. It could be a message or it could be a dialogue. But importantly too, the distractors are going to appear in the text at A2 level. We don't do that at A1 level. And also it is a little bit longer, the text is a little bit longer, and it's graded for K2 and A2 lexical and grammatical levels. Looking at features of the task, you'll notice here that that's also K1 and A1. And what you'll usually notice is that the features of the task are usually a level lower than the text. So if you have a B1 text, for example, then the task should be pitched at A2 level. If you have a B2 text, it should be pitched at B1 level, and so on. Obviously at A1 level we can't go any lower, but at A2, the text is A2, but the task itself should be graded for K. Okay, that brings us more or less to the end. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, please post them in the comment thread below. Thank you.